We are in the midst of one of the most significant discussions of the synthesis of yoga, where Sri Aurobindo is giving us a glimpse of what the divine consciousness and its divine life will be experienced as. You will recall in the earlier chapters, he described how one can ascend into an experience of utter oneness, in which everything is held in oneness. And then he says, from this universal oneness, with this new consciousness, if we are to possess perfectly the world from this new consciousness, then we have to know each thing in the way the divine knows it. And the divine knows each thing as an absolute. Everything is the divine absolute expressing itself. And we have to know, therefore, each thing, each experience, each object as a divine absolute. Now, this is setting for us first a rational understanding. But what would it mean in practice? And this is the discussion which followed. And here he makes two extraordinary statements. The first, that the absolute is everywhere. It has to be seen and found everywhere, in each object, in each thing, in all the relatives. It is the absolute which is present. Absolute with a capital A, meaning that absolute which normally we think is only beyond the universe, beyond manifestation. But it's actually everywhere, because everything is itself expressed. And the second extraordinary statement, which is like the obverse of this, he says, every finite is an infinite and has to be known and sensed in its intrinsic infiniteness, as well as its surface finite appearance. So the reality of this world, as the divine sees it, not only that everything is itself absolute, but every finite appearance actually is an infinite. It's not represents an infinite, but is an infinite. And we should be able to see that infinite as well as the appearance of the finite. Meaning between the two, finite and infinite, the finite appearance is an appearance. The infinity which it holds, which it expresses, which it is the reality. And that's how the divine sees it, because that's how the divine has imaged himself in everything. And that was the point he made. In that experience, he says, we have to first of all know the whole world in this way, and every object in the world in this way. Such would be the nature of the divine life. Now, you will see today in the popular discourse, in the New Age communities and philosophies or practices, a lot of talk about divinization of life because somehow that idea has seized human beings. If you go back barely 50 years ago, everybody spoke of divine and life as separate. Now it is fashionable to speak of spirituality in life, divinizing life, and things like that. But if you probe behind the words, you will find the idea that people carry is very different. The idea is, well, you will still have your normal life, and into it there will be a little bit of devotion or some sense of the sacred presence in things, or everything will be somehow raised and made a little more beautiful, a little more divine. So, the concept of divine life or divinization of life is nothing but an existing life experience a little bit lifted, a little bit more beautiful or sacred. But Sri Aurobindo's concept, or Sri Aurobindo has set for us an ideal which is radically different. It is to experience the world and every object in the world the way the divine experiences it. To share in the divine vision, the divine experience, the divine touch, and the divine play as the divine experiences it. That would be our concept of divine life. And this is way beyond anything which is even conceived of in humanity today. Here, in this description, we get a glimpse of it. When the divine looks at the flower, it sees here the absolute. It sees here the infinite. Because this flower is an expression of the divine himself, representing himself as flower, but the whole of the divine appearing as flower. And so, in that experience, not only the beyond, but all here. Not only the totality, the all in its mass, but each thing in the all becomes to us our self, God, the absolute and infinite, Satchidananda. So he's given four perspectives. First of all, this flower is not other, it is myself. Not just a projection or a reflection of myself, not just some essential part of me that I share with the flower, but it is me entirely. And everything we experience, everything we touch in the divine life is me entirely. So, first it is myself, and it is the most subjective experience. A step further, and we discover it is what is that self? It is God. It is the one who has become everything. It is that which is not only my truth, but also for each object. The third level of the experience deepening, and he uses two words, the absolute and infinite, A capital, I capital. Meaning the absolute here is not a mental idea, but the experience of that which we knew outside, beyond all manifestation, beyond all relativity. And the infinite, capital I, is not just the way the mind conceives it, but it is the presence which is itself beyond all description, beyond all limits. And it is not only a spatial infinity, it is not only a timeless or transcendence of time, it is infinite beyond all possibilities of conception. Meaning all possibilities are present, pouring through, and still it is never finished. So this capital I infinite and capital A absolute carry in them a very important idea that it is everything that can be, all of that pouring through, which still not exhaust that which is waiting to emerge. And it is that whole infinite possibility. It is the containing of everything that can ever be and beyond all descriptions of what can be. It is that which is the infinite and absolute. That which we normally know to be out there on the edge or beyond creation, that is right here in everything as everything. And this is how the divine sees. And from here, there is a fourth step of the experience, Satchidananda. It is the all real, all consciousness, all force, all knowledge, all bliss, all love as the divine. And that is what each object is. When we meet the flower, it is we as mind meeting flower as form. And my mind can study the shape. But the reality behind this appearance is me is only a pale reflection of the divine himself present. Meeting what? On the other side, the divine himself present. It is Satchidananda here meeting Satchidananda in this form, and Satchidananda experiencing always in the relationship the real Sat, the utter consciousness and power of consciousness, and the complete bliss of the relationship. And this is how the divine experiences every object in the world and the whole world as a whole. And it is in that consciousness that we have to live. And it is that which is the divine life that Sri Aurobindo sets for us. Anything short of this is incomplete or at best a step towards this. And of this experience, he says, this is the secret of complete delight in God's world. Complete satisfaction of the mind and heart and will. Complete liberation of the consciousness. And the emphasis on the word complete is the important thing here. It shows you that this is the finality to which we have to grow, or to which evolution and the whole cosmos is working towards. But this finality has three aspects. The first is the secret of complete delight in God's world. The world itself being an outburst of delight, meant to express and play out the delight. You are not truly participating in a divine life if you are not participating in that play of the delight. And that delight cannot be partial, it has to be complete to be the divine life. And the secret of the complete delight is this vision. So the first aspect is of the play of delight. The second aspect is of the complete satisfaction of the mind and heart and will. So you may live in the delight, you may experience the delight, but satisfaction is the subjective sense that everything is complete as is. There is no lack. There is nothing missing. In our human experience, however wonderful the experience, however tasty the food, however magical the relationship, however beautiful an object, however fulfilling our interactions with things, there is always the sense that something more is possible or something is missing. And therefore, however complete it may seem, somewhere inside us we know, and there is a dissatisfaction, which is good, which is necessary, because it acts as a goad eventually to say, now I'm bored, I need something more, the thing which was missing. But at what point do you know that your experience is complete with nothing missing? When you experience in this way the completeness of the divine in each object, in each interaction. And therefore he says, this is the secret of complete satisfaction of the mind and heart and will. These are the three components of our personality which are the primary drives of dissatisfaction or to put it in a more positive term, the primary drives towards greater satisfaction or completeness. In the whole evolution, these are the three impulses which drive us. In the one of the traditional invocations to the Divine Mother in Lalita Sahasranama, the 1,000 names of the Divine Mother, she is described as three powers: Ichha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti. Shakti means the power, the energy. Ichha is the desire, the wanting. The Jnana is the knowledge, the seeking. And Kriya is action, the will. These are the three things which in us are always pushing for more. You desire more from the heart. You want to know more. You want to do more. And from the moment we are born, or even before we are born, you will find these are the three impulses which are goading us. You withdraw these three, and we would be a lump no different from a stone, unable to or having no interest in movement or action. These are the three things which glimpse the incompleteness of the experience and are always pushing us towards complete satisfaction. And when do we have that complete satisfaction? Here. This experience is the secret of complete satisfaction. And the third aspect of the experience is complete liberation of the consciousness. In the very act of chasing satisfaction, partial or complete, we find ourselves attached. We find ourselves bound, tied down, because having got this, if I lose it, I will lose what I have, what little I have. I know I cannot have everything, but what little I have, I'm now afraid of losing. Or even while I have it, the satisfaction becomes less and less over time. So I'm already losing it. And what can you do? You are in a state of distress the moment you're attached to an object or a form. But if instead you begin to relate to the one as your self, God, the absolute and infinite, as Satchidananda, with every object and with the whole universe, with the world as a whole, you will find there is no attachment. Things come, things flow, things change in appearance, but that Satchidananda is always. And your relationship, your enjoyment of it is also on that base, infinite, absolute. And therefore, you are completely free in every experience, although having the most complete satisfaction and although having the full delight in God's world. And so the secret of of delight in God's world, complete satisfaction of mind, heart, and will, complete liberation of the consciousness, and all human art, poetry, subjective and objective attempts to know are really seeking towards this experience. So here he has set for us the framework that now must be realized. In the context of the journey, as we have been studying it, this question comes after a person has already experienced the underlying oneness. And now we want to extend that oneness not only in some high state of consciousness, but in our day to day engagement. Not only experience oneness, but the absolute, the infinite, in every object, in everything. And it is this which will make for the completeness of the divine life. And so this is the challenge before us, to which Sri Aurobindo is leading, showing us the way. As a first step in the way, we will begin to perceive through the mind at least. Now remember, the whole thing could be done top down. One has reached the oneness and now you re-embrace the whole creation from above in the way the divine images himself. Or at the same time, as we read this with our mind, we can begin to reshape our mind's perception and begin to review things and realign this. He explains how it is possible, and this was the paragraph we read last time. It is possible to conceive of the absolute and the infinite as somewhere out there, beyond the universe. Now, why is he focusing on the absolute and the infinite? Because practically, the thing which allows you to glimpse the Satchidananda, to know it as God, is the perception that here, in this appearance of relative, is the concealed infinite absolute. Front is finite, appears relative, that's an appearance. Behind is the absolute and the infinite. And as we have seen, the absolute is everywhere. And the every finite is an infinite. Now, to be able to see that, that's the immediate focus. So these are the two words you will find becoming extremely important in the text as we proceed. Can we experience everything as an absolute or an infinite? At the very least, concealed behind the appearance. Can we glimpse it? And here he says, we can start with the idea that that is only available out there. And the result will be you will obviously not find it here. You will say it is only out there. But, he says, if we start from the larger conception, a completer truth, and a wider experience open to us, we perceive that and he describes how we begin to see it. But the starting point has to be corrected. And what is the correction? He uses three phrases: larger conception, completer truth, wider experience open to us. He's saying it's right now open to us. It's not something which you have to wait until eventually someday you'll get it. So these three things are actually available to us as we are. First is larger conception. You can change your conception of the world, of the divine, of your relationship with the divine. And let's see what that correction is. Ordinarily, he said, and this was the paragraph last time, your discriminating mind tells you that only what is beyond all manifestation is absolute. Only the formless spirit is infinite. Only the timeless, spaceless, immutable self in rest is absolutely real. And if this is your starting point, well, it will be only that. Because anything which you glimpse, you will say, it is not that, and you will keep eliminating it. So what is this wider, larger conception that we have to start with? The larger conception is that yes, there is the absolute, there is the infinite, immutable, timeless, spaceless existence up there, but also the conscious force and delight of the divine being possessing the full pouring out of its powers. That also is absolute. So it is there behind doing nothing, static, but when it begins to pour out what? Remember, infinite possibilities, infinite energies, infinite forms, infinite experiences, infinite play of consciousness. Everything pours out blissfully as a delight. The power which contains all this, carries all this pouring out, that also is absolute. It's an example Sri Aurobindo gives. If you want to glimpse in the universe the sense of something absolute, well, look at that which holds the totality of the universe. Everything inside is changing, but in the total, nothing has changed. And so he is giving you this link point, the energy which is pouring out, the totality of it, the one who holds that energy, who is himself, herself pouring out, that also is absolute, possessing all its powers and qualities blissfully, creating itself. And it is the same absolute, the same infinite. So much the same that we can enjoy simultaneously, equally, the divine timeless calm and peace, and the divine time possessing joy of activity, freely, infinitely, without bondage. Both we can embrace, that timeless calm and this time full, time possessing joy of activity. Who is possessing the same divine pouring out is the same absolute. If you have that, then you can turn like this and experience this also and possess this also. Of course, you will possess from a consciousness like that, which is embracing everything, but you will possess it. And this opens to you the possibility. If you have that consciousness embracing the whole movement, it can also embrace a part of the movement and experience here also the same absolute, because your consciousness holds that absolute, that infinite, and sees it expressing in this. Now, here you have the first correction, that the absolute and the infinite, while they are there, are also experienceable here. And if you begin to change this perspective of your mind, you will find that it is not so difficult, it's not so distant. The second change which we have to make, he says, a completer truth. The truth which we earlier, or at least the thinking mind came to as a conclusion, was that can only be there, outside somehow. And the moment it pours out, it has to be bound or is somehow limited to relativities and finites. But if you think about it, the completer truth is everything expressed here is that. If that is oneness which is indivisible, every form must be itself, cannot be divided. Remember? If there is one divine consciousness which cannot be divided, everything it expresses must be the whole of itself. And therefore, it should be possible to perceive the whole of the divine, absolute, infinite, right here in the form that appears on the front as finite and relative. So, this is the second correction we make. There is a more complete truth. The partial truth is that that is there and this is not that. The completer truth is, yes, that can be experienced there, but this also is that, putting a different appearance, but it is still that. And then the third correction, and we start with a wider experience open to us. What's the experience here? Can you actually attune yourself to this idea and begin to see it, feel it, dwell on this? And immediately you will find a certain part of you begins to lean with a joy, with a certain delight towards this truth, and begins to feel it more and more close. It starts with a very simple exercise. You will recall Sri Aurobindo in the jail when he was put in solitary imprisonment. After a while, by some intervention, he was allowed to walk for a few minutes in the garden. But before that, only through the little window high above, he could see a patch of the sky and a little patch of the greenery of the tree. And the rest was barren, blank wall and a few ants wandering around. But he says when he got a chance to walk, he began to remember there the timeless verses of the Isha Upanishad, saying that all this is verily for the habitation of the Lord. Ishavasyam idam sarvam. Or all this is verily the divine. Sarvam khalu idam Brahman. Dwelling on these verses, he said he would look at the trees, he would look at the different objects, beings, people, and try to imprint the vision of that all this is inhabited by the divine presence. All this is Brahman expressing itself in so many forms. And then he describes how gradually the truth of it began to become more and more vivid, more and more intense. until it began to fill him. And he felt this peace and joy caressing him, filling him, and all the rest. And eventually he could see it in the blank walls, in the ant wandering in his little cell, and so on. But the exercise itself is so simple. And what you see here in these three phrases is precisely the approach that we take. First, we make a correction, a larger conception, a completer truth, and from there it moves into a wider experience open to us. Spending a few minutes every day, or you're sitting having nothing to do, simply look at objects, simply look at people, look out of the window, or at what is before you, and dwell on the idea that all this is expression of the Brahman for the purpose of the play of its delight. And it's expressing as this and as that. You can sit in the marketplace, in the most disturbed space, and dwell on this idea. And after a while, you will find the things which are disturbing you in the market space, they begin to fade out. Instead, a kind of a wide, detached calm fills, and then a kind of a quiet joy begins to fill. And you see all these people doing their drama, and it's all like a movie, and you begin to laugh at it. Ah, this is so interesting, so much fun. And you perceive the play of the divine in this whole slow process of the play and the evolution. And all this is available to us in the wider experience open to us. If we take this, let's say, 3 steps, it begins the process. And the process leads to what eventually? The same absolute and infinite we can now begin to enjoy in equally the divine timeless calm and peace and the divine time possessing joy of activity, freely, infinitely, without bondage. And if this we can have there and generally here, he says we should be able to have this in everything and down to the every detail and every principle which is working in the universe, in the workings of this force. Remember, the point earlier was it is the same absolute embracing the force, but is it still embracing every working of the force inside? Every thread, every fiber of energy that moves to become the appearance of a separate object. And so, this is the line where we have ended. So, too, we can have the same experience of all the principles of this activity, which in the immutable are self contained and, in a sense, drawn in and concealed, in the cosmic are expressed and realize their infinite quality and capacity. So, every principle working, and principle we'll see the next one that he takes up, the most important principle is the principle of duality of soul and nature. Every principle also in its working we should be able to glimpse this underlying infinity and absolute. But we will notice that the infinity and absolute immutability are withdrawn and concealed in that static part, and in the plane, the cosmos, they are released for the purpose of the play, they are expressed. But in their expression, they realize their infinite quality and capacity. Meaning, every principle, every force, every power, every action is playing out its infinite quality and infinite capacity, and we will be able to glimpse that. So, as a first step now, he takes the most important of these principles, and this unfolds over a couple of chapters. He will show you how this principle operates, why it is so important, and how, even in the working of this principle, actually there is an underlying infinity and an absolute. Not just concealed, but they can actually be perceived. And this will be the rest of the journey. And then he will also look at other subsequent principles which derive from this. What he is doing effectively In the big picture across chapters, there was the ascent to the oneness of the Sachidananda. From there, the embracement of the whole multiplicity. And now, as you descend, you recognize how the one plays out through many aspects. What are the powers and principles it uses to construct or express itself as the cosmos? And at each point of its splitting or division of workings, you embrace and find the unity underlying and the infinity and the absoluteness in the working. So it's like a top down. You found the oneness there, and now you're stitching together the whole cosmos. Like a zip going down, zoop, everything is united down to the tiniest detail, the oneness, the absolute, the infinity experienced. That will be our experience of the divine life. So it's a bit top down, so he takes the most important principle there. The first of these principles in importance is the duality, which resolves itself into a unity. But what is the duality of? Of Purusha and Prakriti. Now you see, he says first of these principles in importance, because once you get this, you will find everything else, all the other principles will be easier to resolve. Purusha and Prakriti, which we have had occasion to speak in the yoga of works, but which is of equal importance for the yoga of knowledge. So, in the yoga of works, there was a discussion which we have not studied in these series of classes yet, but there's a discussion where the whole question of who is doing the work comes up. Let's say you are doing some activity. I am the one who plucked the flowers, who threaded them, arranged them in a garland, and placed them here. I did. But is it really so? If you observe more carefully, you notice that pretty much everything that's happening within you is being done. Well, let's look at inside. Who's breathing? I can say, I am breathing. Yes, you see, I breathe in, I breathe out at will. But actually, what do you do? Are you expanding the lungs? Are you taking in air? At best, you can say, I allow the breath to happen, or I do not interfere, or I will it, but the act of breathing is done by the muscles and the lungs. I am not muscles, I am not lungs. Who's pumping your heart? Not really me. If you start going into detail, you notice that most of what's happening is happening by some kind of automation. Who's thinking in the brain? You can say, I am moving the electricity from this cell to the other. No, that won't be true. I want to think, and the electricity moving happens, right? So, which part is really me, and which part is the automatism of nature? If you begin this process of introspection, you'll find very quickly everything that's moving gets separated from you and is found to be part of the automatism of nature. And that's when the problem comes. When I'm thinking, when I think that I'm free, when I actually thought to pluck the flowers and thread them together to make the garland, did I really freely do it? Or was it the automatism of nature which triggered the thought, which triggered the will, which triggered the action of the muscles and made it happen? And the introspection which it leads to, which is part of that discussion, is actually everything that you do is a product of this process of nature. The only thing where you are able to intervene is to say, yes, I accept to do, or I withhold from doing. So the breathing is happening, I can withhold, hold your breath. Or I can let go and then it happens. I have thoughts, I have impulses, I can withhold the impulse and refuse to act to pluck the flower. And then another thought and another impulse comes. Instead of plucking the flower, I will do this, or I will do that, I will walk away, I will climb the tree. And I can accept or reject, accept or reject. What you realize in your experience of nature, of life, is a series of options are given to you, not by you, by nature. All you can do is say yes or no to them. And if you reject an option, she pops immediately another option. And if you reject that, another. Even if you accept one, she pops you another variation of it, another choice. She keeps throwing these things at you. And if you do nothing, she leads you to do them anyway. The big difference between the ape and the human is that the ape does not have a conscious sense of volition refusing. Even its refusal is part of the machinery. How much of our refusal is really, truly refusal? So try to hold your breath. How long can you refuse to breathe? Eventually, nature hits you so hard, you cannot. And you actually realize your sense of I, which could choose, is itself very fragile, very superficial, and weak. Itself is a construct of nature. Is there at all a real I that can refuse or accept? And the introspection leads you to the recognition that, yes, behind those layers, and there are many layers of I with increasing freedom, but behind them all, there is some kind of an I that can actually say, I am none of these things. And I can accept to engage or I can refuse to engage, but the thing itself will continue to happen irrespective of your acceptance or not. And so here we have a clear separation between the consciousness which seems to participate, which seems to choose or enjoy, and then the activity itself, which is not its product. And it is this split, this division, this duality, which is referred to in the Yoga of Works. And it is critical to understand what is our true nature of freedom or of free will in action. Who is doing the action and how much of it is really you? And so that was the part of the larger discussion there. And this comes back to us also in the Yoga of Knowledge. There's a division, there's a clear division between two things. But now we need to name those two things. We need to understand what those two things really are. And he gives you a series of names, terms, which have been developed over in different traditions or different approaches. Now, he's not giving you a historical survey. He is not going to tell you, these people called it that, those people called it that. That doesn't matter. You call it by any name, it doesn't change it. But if you go deep into it, you will find there are different ways of looking at these two things. And those names are important because there are different ways of looking at it. And he will give you three different ways of looking at it, which traditionally have been named in certain ways, but conceptually are different. And so it's important to understand what is the conceptual difference between these things. First, he says, the Vedantins. No, sorry, we've missed a line. This division, Purusha and Prakriti, this division was made most clearly by the old Indian philosophies. It was made by other traditions also. You will find similar things in the Greek traditions, but it is not made so clearly, and the exploration of the depth of these two in the duality is not as complete. So he will draw now from the Indian tradition for these. But it bases itself upon the eternal fact of practical duality in unity, upon which the world manifestation is founded. This is a practical fact. Whether you accept it or not, this is so. That the whole manifestation of the world is built on a certain duality. That's why he spoke earlier of it, the duality which resolves itself into a unity. But if the unity is underlying, the duality is the practical basis for the world manifestation. If you don't have the duality, you cannot have manifestation. Now, in earlier discussions, perhaps many months ago, we have looked at some examples to understand this. If you consider, first take a very simple analogy. If you consider an artist who wants to paint, draw, you take your colors. You can have innumerable colors, infinity of materials, some sticky, some rough, some soft, some hard. But you need the canvas on which you're going to apply those. Now, the canvas cannot be infinitely varied. If the canvas is soft, you cannot use a hard brush or a hard pencil. It will cut through, damage the canvas, right? What are the ideal characteristics of a canvas? If the canvas itself is sticky and I apply paint brush to it, as I apply the paint, the canvas will get dragged along. Try to keep a loose sheet of paper and write on it without holding the paper down. The paper will move with the pen. Doesn't work. You have to have something which is static, unmoving, against which your paintbrush will flow. In order for you to be able to use all possible materials, the soft ones and the hard ones, the sticky ones as well as the non-sticky, this canvas must be completely rigid, unmoving. It cannot impose any of its properties on your paints. If the canvas is selective, it is homophobic, it does not like water, then you cannot use watercolors. If the canvas is too sticky, then your paintbrush will stick and you will not be able to flow. It should not put any preference on the picture at all. And what do you have then? An ideal canvas on which you can use any color, any material, any quality. And so here you get the necessity for duality. There must be something which is unchanging, completely neutral in its response, allowing everything else to play out freely. And on the other side, if you want a really rich picture, you must have every possible color, every possible material, every possible experience of any kind. And then you can have the free play of the artist doing the most crazy expressions. And that's what you see in the universe. The universe is formed out of this double process. One underlying, neutral, supporting, unchanging, static backdrop. No preferences at all. On the other side, full, wild, infinite play of infinite possibilities playing around in space and time. And so this first one is the Purusha, static, unchanging. At best, you can say it enjoys the drama being enacted, but itself never engages or interacts or shows preference. And on the other side, the Prakriti, the name itself tells you, Prakriti. Kriti is activity, action. Pra is forceful, intentional, or special form of free action. And you have this Prakriti, nature flowing around. Now, where is this canvas? I'm looking for it. Remember, this is a 3D world that we are seeing. Well, you can even add a fourth dimension of time, but where is the canvas? Empty space is how you see it, because no paint has been applied on it. Now, when into that empty space I create some paint, some play of energy, I have an object. Here is form of energy held by empty space as canvas, except that space is not really empty. It has the power to support and hold the energy. The energy sticks to it, right? And yet the energy can flow without being stuck on it. So it has this very interesting character. It supports. It is this because otherwise it can't support, and yet it is somehow detached from it and allows the play to change. And it itself is not stuck in your 3D space. It allows the changing, unfolding of time. And the canvas is remaining unchanged across time. So the moment before when the flower was here and the moment now when the flower is not here, the canvas is extending across time and across space, infinitely, in every way. It is unmoving while time moves across it. The flower comes, plays, and goes. the canvas is unchanged across time. Purusha, essential existence, which is consciousness, which is also blissful. On the other side, the play which is happening is also real existing power of consciousness, energy of consciousness, playing, working, and enjoying the delight of the play. Both are poises of Satchidananda. But in the first picture he gives, so we'll see this now in three different pictures. It is given different names according to our view of the universe. Now you can look at the universe this way, that way, that way, that way, and each would give you a slightly different way of looking at it. The Vedantins spoke of the self and Maya, meaning according to their predilections by the self, the immutable, and by Maya, the power of the self, the power the self has of imposing on itself the cosmic illusion. Or, and this is the second meaning, or by the self, the divine being, and by Maya, the nature of conscious being and the conscious force by which the divine embodies himself in soul forms and forms of things. Others spoke of Ishwara and Shakti, the Lord and his force, his cosmic power. Now, these are three pairs. Unfortunately, two of the pairs have exactly the same terms, but they mean different things. So he has used first the Vedantins. Vedanta, the term itself, Veda Anta, end of the Veda, after the Veda, post-Vedic. And in the Vedic tradition, there's a different view with the same vocabulary. And here is the same vocabulary now being used with a slightly different and perhaps significantly different meaning or orientation. And so that's why he is saying Vedantins having two groups, those closer to the Veda, those which have drifted away in their own specialization. They use these two terms, self, Atman, and Maya, Brahman or Maya. But two different meanings. In the first one which he gives is the most reduced meaning. Second one he will give will be closer to the Vedic. And then the third he gives will be something much more rich and complete. So we are starting with that which is the rational mind. When the rational mind looks at things, well, it has to cut. It has to separate. It does not like mixture. It does not like something which is too complexly rich, interwoven. It needs to separate somehow to have the satisfaction. And so this is the approach. The power, so first it says, it means by self the immutable, that which is unchanging. Remember the backdrop we saw? It cannot change. If it changes, if it moves, well, you don't have the free play possible. It's going to stick, it's going to mess around. Just for argument's sake, suppose even the canvas moves. What's the problem? The canvas moves with your brush against what? You see here I laid the paper, I apply the brush and the paper moves. Against what? Against the table. What if I apply so much force the table moves? Against what? Against the ground. You see, the problem is if you speak of a canvas moving, it is always moving against in relation to something which is not moving. Eventually, always implied is an absolute reference which is unmoving. That's the Purusha. Okay? So, we have to have something which is immutable, unchanging. If it was not, there could be no movement. So, one side is self, unchanging, and the other side is this Maya, the power the self has of imposing on itself the cosmic illusion. Now, this is the approach of the illusionist philosophies. They will say, only reality is self. But how do you explain all this movement? Well, somehow there is this power From where? Obviously, it has to be of the self, because there's nothing other than self. But it has the power of putting up a front of an illusion, like a cinema projected on the screen. That's a very good example. The light is being projected, the light is playing, and what happens really? The wall never changes, the screen never changes. It's only a play of light. You see images of people, you see animals, you see all kinds of crazy things. You switch off the light of the projector, it's all gone. It was never really there. You thought it was a person who was happy. You thought he was crying, but it was never really there. It was a play of light. Where did the light come from? And so the problem is this in the whole approach of the illusionist Maya, that it is a power that the self has of imposing on itself the illusion of the cosmos. And Sri Aurobindo, when he criticizes this philosophy, he says it would be a bit dissatisfying to say that the greatest power of the self is a power of illusion. Something is wrong there. And of course, the philosophy never expresses how that power came to be or why at all it needs to create that illusion and somehow be sucked into an illusion and bound into the illusion. But in the philosophy, the idea is somehow this power creates the illusion of the cinema, and the screen binds itself in fascination. Hey, this is an interesting cinema, and it thinks it has become the person in the cinema, when in fact it was never there. And if somehow you can snuff out the light, snuff out the illusion, poof, you pop back and you're free in the unchanging, immutable backdrop. So that's the approach of one later Vedantins. You grow closer to the Vedic Vedantins, and then you find a different meaning to the same words. Here, he says, by self, the divine being. Now, it's not something unchanging, flat, pure, essential awareness. It is conscious, divine being. It is He. It is the Lord. And by Maya, it is the nature of conscious being and conscious force. Meaning, let's say, I look at myself. What is nature of me? I am, I exist. What kind of a person are you? I'm a kind, loving, sensitive, caring person. That's the nature of being. Now, even in the Buddhist tradition, you have very interestingly, this similar idea. They will speak of nirvana as the underlying backdrop, the underlying reality. And then there is the nature of emptiness, the nature of nirvana. And that becomes as if the equivalent of the divine power, the divine play. And there is still the idea that you allow the nature of that emptiness to flow and be in life. And so that's the equivalent concept in a tradition which does not recognize divine being, but still it recognizes nature of emptiness. But here, if you have divine being, what's the nature of divinity? Well, it is all love, all goodness, all happiness, all beauty. So the nature of conscious being, if it is conscious, it has volition, it has force, it has action. So the moment you have nature of the divine being, by which the divine embodies himself in soul forms and forms of things. So the moment you have force, with force you can construct form. Of what? Of divine. And the same divine being gives itself a form of limited appearance, but only as a limited appearance. Let's say this space filling across space, across time is divine being, presence of being, and you feel it as a solid presence of the self. And yet, as power of being, it can whirl out an energy, and as a whirl of energy, it can carve out and isolate a portion of this space, creating a bubble. And then it creates another bubble, and then it joins the bubble to create an aggregate bubble, like foam. What does foam do? It is the same seawater, but creating containers, isolating, combining the underlying space, and then being able to give the appearance of anything. But what is the appearance made of? That which was always inside, filling it, and the energy of the consciousness forming as if the surface, concealing or creating an appearance of separateness. Stop the energy, pop the bubble, and poof, it was always there. The divine being was always there. So it's as if this conscious force of being is trying to carve out or create vehicles or embodiment, giving body to the divine being. So, by which the divine embodies himself in soul forms and forms of things. So, there are two forms. One is essential soul form. This flower has something in it which is so magical. It's almost like it's conscious. And you've created a form of consciousness, but without visible containing limit. But yet it is a character of consciousness, a specific quality, a specific bundle expressing the divinity. And then form of things, which is the physical shape of the flower, which is containing that consciousness. So there are two forms. Soul form, kind of an essential form, which is not binding to form itself, like in physical space, but binding to qualities and form of qualities. No physical limits there. I'm a good person. Goodness is my soul form. He's not meaning here the deepest, inmost psychic being soul, but just essential. So, quality of table is its support, its strength. Quality of tiger is its forcefulness and violence. Quality of the lion is its royalty. You see, in each thing there is a certain essential quality. And then there's the form of the body, which is as if concealing this quality or expressing this quality. You could knock out the form of the body, but that soul form would still be there. The body is as if an extension of the soul form in the domain of physical space and time. So, divine embodies himself in soul forms and forms of things. Now, the forms of things, he has used a very general term. It could include also things which are non physical. You have vital beings, mental ideas, even ideas have a form. So, if you are clairvoyant, you will see an idea emerging and taking form like a cloud. And it will have colors, it will have shapes, it will have densities, it will have qualities. But if you get rid of the form itself, there's a quality, essential quality of the idea, which we may call the soul form of the idea. What the idea truly contains, shorn of its specifics. And so everything in the universe is really soul form and form of things, where it becomes a thing in itself. So let's reread the second idea of self and Maya. Or by the self, the divine being, and by Maya, the nature of conscious being and conscious force, by which the divine embodies himself in soul forms and forms of things. If we had to draw an analogy, you remember earlier we took the analogy of the cinema screen and the light shining on it. An analogy for this, one analogy, would be the modern TV screen. There's no light shining on it. The light is emitted from within it. You see? Each pixel on the screen is an LED, light emitting diode. A little current passes and it gives off light. What are the images made of? Of itself. The screen itself becomes those images. It's not image shone on it by another. Right? If you could extend this, let's take it down a couple of years. The technology is already there, but we need now to make it more publicly accessible to give these examples. But you've heard of a hologram. You know what is a hologram? A three-dimensional image. Created by what? By light emerging from the screen. Now, so far what you're seeing on your TV screen is the light expressive of the screen playing on the screen. In the three-dimensional holograms, it extends beyond the screen and forms a 3D image. From what? Out of itself. Its own light put out to form a soul form or form of things. You see? And the whole universe is nothing but the divine being on one side and his conscious force projecting itself to create form of things, which is filled by his conscious being, quality of his consciousness which fills inside it. And you see now the relationship between the two is not so harsh. They are as if aspects of each other. You still have divine being as the backdrop supporting, but then the divine being pours out to take on these forms of itself. If you compare the two philosophies, the first one representing the idea that the world is illusory and somehow magically there's this power of deception or illusion projected onto the self. And here you have this other idea, self projecting or representing itself through these forms. You can see this is much more deeply satisfying. It is also closer to the original Vedic concept. But why should we have these two philosophies? Why at all that this should be possible? Why wouldn't you stay with the more satisfying, deeper truth? Because in fact, the way we experience the world is closer to this, that the forms appear illusory. We do not see the underlying divinity that fills them, which would be the experience here, except in occasional glimpses. And we see it like this more because we approach it through the mind. And the mind, when it starts penetrating, it starts dissecting, it starts cutting, chopping, discarding. What is it left with? Dry distinctions, abstract ideas. And so it sees somehow here is movement of energy, here is foundation unchanging, and they are separate. Nothing can ever join them because that's the nature of your mind. In the analysis of science, you end up with this conclusion. Somehow we find two poises, we can never find something which joins them. In the more intuitive approach, you will get to this experience. Yes, I can experience it in two ways, but it is just two statuses of something. You feel the underlying sense of continuity. This becomes that, or this represents itself as that. But now we come to a third, in which we actually experience the joining of the two, and the two as simply aspects of the same one. And this is what he comes to now. Others spoke of Ishwara and Shakti, the Lord and his force, his cosmic power. The Shakti is Ishwara pouring out his energy. Ishwara is Shakti coming back to rest. Now, this is how we would present it to the mind. In reality, both poises are simultaneous. The poise that conceives and the poise that pours out to execute what it conceives are simultaneous. They are one which the mind can see as this or that, but actually it is never really separate. Wherever is Ishvara, he is Shakti expressing. Wherever is expression of Shakti, he is Ishvara underlying. And so, for a philosophical discussion, we may split them as two, one being facet of the other, but in reality, it is always one indivisible reality, taking as if two poises. Again, the way the mind can formulate are fascinating and useful to play with, but the intuition must keep always this vision behind. In the Kashmir Shaivism, there is a beautiful text which describes how the universe is born. And the Lord conceives of the universe. And of course, whatever he conceives is real, so he becomes what he conceives. Except that as he moves to become, he pauses. Because the moment he becomes, he will lose his poise of freedom. And he will not cross the threshold of his freedom. So he pauses. Now you see the shift. He is simply blissful. And then he conceives of the universe and takes the poise and about to launch and pauses there. That shift is so subtle. It's only a poise of the Lord ready to burst out. Everything, all the energies are held, but nothing is moving. It's like the lion ready to pounce, all the muscles, all the energy completely still. The energy is waiting, and all you have to do is release and poof, it'll burst out. But nothing is moving. See, this is the second poise of the Lord. And then, because he does not want to lose himself, lose his freedom in the movement, he pauses, and instead that contained energy that is him, that is his, that flows out. And that becomes the universe. He remaining in this poise which holds the energy static, and the energy pours out of him. And she whirls out to become the universe. Now, if you dwell on this, you meditate on each of these three poises, you will find they're not really different. They're just different because it helps us to experience or relate to our human experience. I'm at rest, I'm primed, ready to act, and then the action flows. I experience it as three different stages because I live in a limited body and unfold in time. But the consciousness, which is beyond the time, beyond space, is simultaneously these poises, always, and experiences it everywhere. Now, if you look at it this way, in every form that is emerging out of that creative energy, he is present. He is the center of the form. His presence holds the form like this. If he withdraws, the form collapses because there is nothing other than him. And yet the expression of the form is made by his energy whirling out, by the creative Shakti, who is himself as action. And therefore she can go back to rest in him, and the form fades out and vanishes. She can leap out of anywhere and emerge as form to express him in some way. And no limits to the play, no limits to the possibility. She is the creator. She is him as creator and as power of expression. There's another text, Uma Sahasram by Ganapati Muni, 1,000 Names of the Divine Mother. And in one of his extolling of her greatness, he says of her, she is so all-powerful that out of a blade of grass, she can bring out a roaring fire. And out of roaring fire, she can bring out intense cold. You see, the whole idea is the play of opposites. Sri Aurobindo presents the whole journey of evolution in a similar way. He says every step of evolution is the emergence of something which was impossible. Out of dead matter, you have living matter. Out of unconscious living matter, you have conscious living matter. And then the next step is obviously, out of finite conscious living matter, you have infinite divine consciousness in living matter. You see, that's the divinization even of the physical body and consciousness. But each step is an impossibility. In all that existed before, one could not have imagined the other step, the next step, because there was nothing of it here. And yet when she draws it out of herself, of himself, who is there, infinite potential that he is, when she draws it out and plays it out, we say, yes, it's obvious. It had to be so, because now that's her play. When the plants appear, when they didn't appear, you say, impossible. How can stone move? When they do appear, you say, well, it couldn't have been otherwise. That's obvious. When science maps out the laws of nature, we say, oh, yes, that's how it should be. Otherwise, the universe couldn't exist. No, that's not true. That's how she plays herself out, her energy. And you've only mapped it and said, that's how it is. It's obvious. She could have done it any other way, and still there would have been a universe, a different universe. But it was her freedom to play this way or that. And just to prove it, she often has this, let's say, wiggle room. She plays a little bit here and there, breaking those laws every now and then, and we say, wow, that is unexplainable phenomena. So others spoke of Ishwara and his Shakti, the Lord and his force, his cosmic power. So we have now three visions of this double status, this duality. But there has to be the duality, he says. This division was made most clearly by the old Indian philosophies, but it bases itself upon the eternal fact of practical duality in unity, upon which the world manifestation is founded. So we've seen three views of it. Depending on the inclination of the viewer, you have three different ways of seeing. Now he goes specifically into one of them. One of the views, it is an entire philosophical framework called the Sankhya, which went really deep into this analysis of the separation of the Purusha and the Prakriti, the static and the dynamic aspect, and took it to the extreme. If you analyze it with the mind, and you really go on separating, you will find there is nothing in common between the two. So he's now exploring this first view. The analytic philosophy of the Sankhyas affirmed their eternal duality without any possibility of oneness, accepting only relations of union and separation by which the cosmic action of the Prakriti begins, proceeds, or ceases for the Purusha. Remember, that Purusha is the absolute, and the relativity is of the Prakriti. It originates some action, continues some action, ends some action, always in relation to the backdrop. The paintbrush approaches to touch the backdrop, sweeps across, pulls back. Action originated, action sustained, action withdrew. Just if you take the analogy this way, it's very simple. And there is no possibility of oneness, only relations of union and separation. Okay? When they unite, you have the sense of the play of the movement. When the brush separates, no movement, no play, no action. For, at least this was the way they see it, for the Purusha is an inactive conscious existence. It is the soul, the same in itself and immutable forever, never changing. Prakriti, the active force of nature, which by its motion creates and maintains, and by its sinking into rest, dissolves the phenomenon of the cosmos. Now, it's not just a question of a belief system. Why does he bother to take this analytic philosophy of the Sankhyas? Because analytic philosophy of the Sankhya's is what you come to if you approach with your physical senses and your mind and try to understand the universe. It is in fact exactly the same conclusion that modern science is coming towards. The Sankhya tradition and the modern scientific tradition are very similar. In fact, in their original approaches identical. The Sankhya, similar to modern science, eventually recognizes that if you analyze the processes of nature, you will discover pure energy, and to create form, something which is particulate, force and particle. It reduces all experience of nature to force and particle. Then it tries to analyze what are the essential particulate characteristics and goes to a depth which current science has not yet gone to. But if it continues, we'll eventually end up with exactly this. Current science, again, has not looked at the underlying aspect of consciousness. It sees energy, but it does not understand what drives energy, what initiates, or what gives us the recognition of it. And it has the first glimpses of this in quantum physics, where it realizes the observer's intention or attitude or conscious state somehow modifies the results of the experiment. This recognition is identical with the Sankhya discovery. But science has not yet come to the acceptance that there is this static underlying conscious being. To accept this is too big a leap, and it's held back mostly by the clutter of its rejection of religiosity and things like that, which are all have historical contexts. But you will see most of the scientists who developed quantum mechanics, and this is 100 years ago, large part of them were in Germany. German scientists were all familiar with Vedantic thought. Most of them were students of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And there are many examples of some of them quoting from the Gita when the first atom bomb was exploded. One of those scientists quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, describing the explosive power of the destroyer and so on. Albert Einstein himself, incidentally, greeted the Indian ambassador in chaste Sanskrit, and the ambassador said, "I'm sorry, I don't know Sanskrit," which was a bit of a shame. Schrodinger, Heisenberg were all students of the Vedantic traditions. Nikola Tesla was a student of Swami Vivekananda and studied the Vedantic traditions in depth. Even in his patents, he makes reference to some of these ideas. So, very clearly, the science recognizing these things saw the continuity with the analytic philosophy of the Sankhyas. It did not have the courage then, because of its materialist origin, to accept the aspect of consciousness. It met it repeatedly, but stopped short, unable to accept, yes, it is so. But it is there implied in the whole approach of the science itself and the thinking of the scientists. And so Sri Aurobindo takes trouble to name this not merely as a belief system of a philosophical school, but the reality which you discover when you approach the world and try to understand it with your mind and your physical senses. This is what you'll discover. Leaving aside, he says, leaving aside these philosophical distinctions, we come to the original psychological experience from which all really take their start. And this is the point we're getting at. What does the scientist do? He does not say, let's study philosophies. He says, let me experience reality and analyze. So we all start, all of us, as scientists of consciousness. We leave aside the philosophy and come to the original psychological experience. And what is that? That there are two elements in the existence of living beings, of human beings at least, if not of all cosmos. A dual being, nature and the soul. This is the example we took earlier when observing ourselves. We see, well, I have a biology. The heart is pumping, the lungs are breathing, the stomach is digesting, and everything else is moving. That's nature. I didn't choose it. It's as if, it seems to me, somehow the proper working of this nature makes for my existence. I exist because my body is functioning okay. If you knock it out, well, I will cease to exist. I'm a product of nature, on the one hand. On the other hand, I discover, but I can actually modify my nature. I can hold my breath. I can slow down my heartbeat. I can get excited or I can relax. I can choose. And the choices modify the workings of my nature. I can rule nature. Except that the connection between the two seems to be a little strange. Sometimes it feels as if I am dependent and a product of nature. Sometimes as if it feels as if nature is dependent on my will. I can dominate, I can decide, I can choose. And somehow this relationship, two-way, but of two things which can never be totally joined. I am not nature, at least subjectively, that's how I feel. And on the other hand, nature is not me. And yet we are somehow tied together. What is this relationship? Now, in the next paragraph, which we will take up only next time, but we'll touch upon a few lines. He takes up this idea of the relationship between the two. And again, approaching it as a scientist of consciousness, subjectively observing oneself. He says the duality is self evident, it's there, and without any philosophy, just by the force of your experience. But what do you find in it as even the most materialistic approach, this discarding all concept of soul, comes to the recognition that there is something which we call consciousness or mind, and then there is this whole brain and neural machinery, and they are different. The phenomenon of my mind's working is not a brain. The brain is at best like a organ which has spasms of electricity, but it's not itself the mind. Now you can say mind is a product of the brain, or mind can control the brain, but brain is not mind. That distinction, the duality is clear. It also recognizes that there is an intelligence which you feel with a will. I feel I'm free. I feel I can will. I feel I can change my thoughts, and I can change my biology, at least to some extent. And then he says, and we'll read now the summary of this whole discussion. The whole problem of life resolves itself into this one question: what are we to do with this soul and nature set face to face with each other? This nature, this personal and cosmic activity, which tries to impress itself upon the soul, to possess, control, and determine it. You see what's happening? My body somehow binds itself, compels my mind to think in certain ways. When I face danger, the body is compelling me to get upset. I don't want to get fearful, but I can't help it. It is trying to control me, it is trying to force me. And like you see in the animal, it wants to decide how I should live, right? On the other hand, so first, this nature, personal nature, or larger is cosmic nature. The universe is somehow compelling me. The universe puts a squeeze on my life. The universe throws problems at me, trying to get me to do this or that, to grow up, or whatever it is. I experience nature somehow impacting on me and trying to lead my life somehow. And on the other side, and this soul, which feels that in some mysterious way it has a freedom, a control over itself, a responsibility for what it is and does, and tries therefore to turn upon nature, its own and the world's, and to control, possess, enjoy, or even it may be reject and escape from her. So on the other side, the soul says, I have this feeling that I'm conscious and that I have a free will. I can actually change myself. I can think differently. I can also change my personal nature as well as a larger cosmic nature. I can change my circumstances. I can make my house better. I can repair things. I can make things convenient. I can create safe spaces. So it is really an extension of your personal nature into a larger cosmic nature. But in this whole exercise, it has a feeling of freedom and control over itself, and therefore a responsibility also on its circumstances. If I can control me and I can control my circumstances, I must make it better. And tries therefore to turn upon nature, to control, possess, enjoy. Or on the other side, to escape nature and to get free of nature somehow. Now you see something strange. Nature is trying to control you and drive you to do what it wants. You, on the other hand, feel you are somehow free and have a free will and control on yourself and on nature. And so you turn upon nature and try to control it. Between the two, now you have this tension. But somehow they're never one, they're always separate. And somehow always one seems to overwhelm the other until the other pushes back and then gets pushed back. And if you get fed up with the game, then you say, enough, I want to get out of nature. But can you actually? In order to answer this question, what are we to do with this soul and nature set to face with each other? That's the question. In order to answer that question, we have to know what the soul can do, to know what it can do with itself, to know too what it can do with nature and the world. So this is the question we're getting to. Now you see, this is getting to the very crux of our existence. How did we end up here? What are we doing? What can we do? What's it all about? There's a very interesting book, humorous but profound in its own way, called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you like fantasy, I would recommend it. And one of the key issues that the book raises in the story is the big question. What is the big question? The question of life, the universe, and everything. Now, see, it looks at it, it's very differently worded, but the same idea. Life, individual life perhaps, or larger life. Universe, that's universality. And the everything, which is the equivalent of God. You're not talking of God, but somehow that points to it. And these are the three things: the soul, nature, and then God. And everything revolves around the relationships of these three things. But right now, practically, forget God. We don't know God. We only know ourselves and we know nature and the relationship between these things. What are we to do with this soul and nature set face to face with each other? And this tussle between the two. And see, to answer the question, we have to know three things. To know what the soul can do, to know what it can do with itself, to know also what it can do with nature and the world. So the first question is, the answer we need, the first knowledge we have to have, what can I actually do? I think I'm conscious. I think I have a free will. I think I can exercise my will. But what am I actually capable of? I don't really know. Second, what am I capable of doing on myself? Can I actually change myself as an awareness, as a soul? I can change my thoughts, but still the thoughts are a process. I can change my attitude to thoughts. I can change my quality of awareness. I can make my awareness more awake or more dull. You see, at night when you want to sleep, you can choose to just sink into dullness and slip into sleep. You wake up in the morning, you can choose to speed up the awakening or shift. And it's pure shift of awareness. I can turn awareness to different things. I can change quality of awareness also, make it more sensory based or more introverted, more intuitive. What can you do with your own awareness? What can it do with itself? And then the third question, what can it do with nature and the world? And nature is not just your mind, life, body nature, but also extending beyond. As you see nature's processes, including the forest, but also the whole world without limit. Now, if these three things we need to know in order to be able to answer that question of this, what are we to do with this soul and nature set face to face? Because there's a huge battle going on, a huge struggle over who decides what. And for that, you must first know the answer to these three things. The whole of human philosophy, religion, science is really nothing but an attempt to get at the right data upon which it will be possible to answer the question and solve as satisfactorily as our knowledge will allow the problem of our existence. You see, first you have to get the right data. Then you can answer the question, and then you'll have solved the problem of existence. But to get to the data is the whole of human philosophy, religion, and science. Because we don't even know what the data is. We don't know who we are. We don't know what's our relationship with our mind and our body. We don't know what we are capable of. Nothing is really known. And if you observe, and we will look at this whole text much more in detail, what does philosophy do to understand this? What does religion do? What does science do? And Sri Aurobindo, in some other text, puts these three together as different approaches to answering this problem. And as different approaches, they each have their own way. Each serves a purpose in evolution. Each fails eventually. And when it fails, it gives way to something else. When When philosophy fails, it may give way to religion. When religion fails, it gives way to science. When science fails, it may go back to either philosophy or religion. And when those fail, again, you'll go back and forth across these three. It's a very interesting passage, which also we will study. But all of this paragraph, we will have to go deep into it. And we will have to do that after a gap of about a month, because I'll be out of station, and we'll pick up this text from the 2nd of November. But you see how he has come to the whole crux of our problem of existence. And this we will appreciate more deeply from the perspective of soul and nature, and then he will take us to the deeper secret of it all. Not just the answer that is to this problem and this question, but also how within this is hidden the underlying infinity and the absolute of the divine concretely, both in the soul, in our consciousness, and in our experience of the nature, and how these two will be unified once again in that divine experience, which will be the divine life. So it's a fascinating preparation to come back to the theme at hand, but as a preparation for the theme, it deals with the crux of the problem of our existence. We can pause here and take up any questions or comments.
Some people they raise their consciousness to a certain degree, they stop eating, stop drinking, or they stop breathing, and live their life. But they are very rare, let's say, ontologically manipulated nature, and be everything and how it's possible that who we are in that position, or we're the divine, the creator.
Yes, it's interesting. If you look at all of the human struggles to solve the problem of existence, we have all these strange things, including people taking to alcohol as a way of what? Forgetting. What? To escape somehow. You're stuck in a problem and you're trying to escape it by numbing your consciousness or erasing your memory of the problem itself, or somehow dulling your experience to a degree that you feel as if free from the problem. On the other hand, somebody else says, I must solve it, I must understand. Somebody else says, I must fight it and I must overcome. And each of these attempts of our life is really an attempt to grapple with the problem of what? Existence. The fact that I exist as a soul with a nature is itself the problem because of this duality pushing against each other. And it's not the specifics of my life. I can say I have problems of health, I have problems of business, I have problems of relationship. Generally, the three things, all of the problems are derivative from there. I can say I have problems, but they all resolve themselves to what I am and my nature. Finally, it comes back to this. I have problems with people and relating to people because I am cantankerous, I am obstinate, I am whatever it is you may say. And you are ending up finally with something which is intrinsic to your very sense of identity, which you have to change. or some tendency of your nature. I get angry, I can't help it. I don't want to, but I get angry, and my nature is somehow bound in a knot, and I am slave of that knot. Eventually, you come back to these two things internally to yourself. How do you deal with it? And you try to find escape routes or ways to overcome. And that really forms the bulk of all of our human struggle. And the correction will be to find their underlying true relationship. And in that true relationship, instead of having this struggle between the two, find the resolution in a oneness. We will discover that our consciousness and nature are two facets of the same one, as we saw in the aspect of the Lord and his Shakti, Ishwara and Shakti relationship. It is actually one taking double poise. And when we are able to come back to that, we will find the resolution and their unity. And that's when, from inside out, we will solve this problem of existence. But we will allow him to lead us through the various insightful series of discoveries. See, what he's doing is taking it purely as a human experience. The philosophies are there. They were constructed by this human experience exploration. Modern science is also constructed from this. So let's start with our own exploration, and then he will lead us through the process.
There we have talked about the Vedantic philosophy.
Yes.
And the second line is embodies himself in soul forms and form of things. You made it as one thing, form and soul of form.
Yes.
Maybe the Vedanti is thought as two different soulless forms and
Yes.
soul forms.
Yes.
Is it that way?
No, it's so the two ways, the two Vedantic approaches. One where it sees, so he says the Vedantins spoke of self and Maya, meaning according to their predilections, by the self, the immutable, and by Maya, power of self to impose illusion, or according to a different predilection, the self as divine being and Maya as nature of conscious being creating forms. Okay, so these are the two categories, all under common head of Vedantin. But so Sri Aurobindo uses an older Vedanta and a newer or limited, narrower Vedanta, which is more divided. But in the older Vedantic approach, which is closer to the Vedic, this forms embodied, soul form and form of things is what in the tradition is referred to as Nama and Rupa, name and form. Now you'll find again in the old traditions this thing appears, but in most cases they have lost the meaning of it. In the old Sumerian tradition and later on in the Judaic tradition, in the Abrahamic traditions, also the aspect of naming is there. There is the name and then there is a form. In the biblical tradition, Adam is given by God the right to name the animals. If you think about it as a historical event, it seems a little weird. You know, the animals are already there, and God says now you can give them any names. What's the big deal? You could call them anything. No, Adam here is the conscious soul. And the forms of nature or in nature, and the act of bringing them forward from the soul is that act of naming and giving a form. So the name in itself doesn't hold a form. When I say flower, how do you conceive of flower? By itself, concept of flower does not have a form which binds it. Out of that concept comes a specific form of flower. So the name captures this thing which he has discussed as soul form, and then out of that, the specific form of things which comes. So Nama and Rupa is the term used in the tradition. Everything in the universe is eventually name and form of things, soul form and the form of thing form. Let's say soul form and thing form. Yes.
None of these philosophies which we are studying says that there are things without soul. I mean, that was the question last time.
Yes, okay.
The That's a different thing. But the soul, I think in some philosophies, many Vedas, we have soulless and soulless. Like plants, animals, still have soul, but inanimate things like metal, they will not have a soul.
That depends on specific philosophies, which no, here in fact it is going much deeper. When Sri Aurobindo is speaking here of soul form and form of things, everything has soul form. Okay, so even table being inanimate has soul form. It may not be as an individual conscious soul. See, that's why you specified the soul here is not the psychic being he is referring to. Soul, as a word in English, represents only essence which is free of form, which inhabits the form. So, soul form is like an essential form. Table, soul form is idea of table. So, somebody says, I will construct this. Now, he builds it because he has an idea of it. Somebody names it table in vocabulary, but the idea of it was already there as a support, a base, or something. No? A vehicle which can carry you, you can conceive of. The form you can play with it. But the sole idea behind is the thing which gives to it a specific quality. And then around it, there is the thing form, which is. So here it is used in a very general way. Everything has soul form. Even stone, soul form is the idea of stone, or the quality that this particular stone emanates. You have diamond and you have ruby. The soul form of diamond is the particular quality of the diamondness, and the soul form of ruby is the particular quality of rubiness, which can exist without the physical ruby being present. You see? So it is to this he is referring, and because in this description, he is sweeping across all the levels of nature, not only physical nature, but vital, mental, and even more high, refined. All these have essential soul form and form of thing. Even idea has soul form and form of thing of idea. It's not reference to individualized soul.
So, the third theory, something very new I've heard very the first time he talks of Shakti and Ishwara.
Yes.
So that means Prakriti is Shakti.
Yes. But we use a different term, Prakriti, as distinct from Shakti, to distinguish something. And in Bhagavad Gita, the vocabulary used is para prakriti, that is the higher or transcending prakriti, as distinct from this lower nature we see, apara prakriti. That is divine. So, what happens when the power, the energy flows out of the Lord as the Lord herself? At that point, she is conscious energy, fully conscious of her divinity, holding herself in the same infinite absolute of the Lord. And then as she pours through, there is a movement of self loss, a breaking up to reduce somehow, to leave behind her fullness and power, to take on forms of energy which become more and more as if mechanical, less conscious. And there's a point of transition where she loses or leaves behind the conscious awareness of the divinity and enters a mechanical, unconscious world. It is this which we experience as a scientist or through our senses as physical nature. You do not see the divinity. You do not see the conscious power or the choice. She is bound by her laws, by her habits, by her rhythms. You cannot make it happen differently. And this is the lower nature, lower Prakriti. Now you can say there is the divine energy and then there is Prakriti, or you can say that itself is nature also, but that is divine nature, and this is nature in self loss. So Sri Aurobindo refers to this as the Holocaust of Prakriti. That is the divine Shakti pouring herself to lose herself into darkness. So he speaks of the soul which enters, losing its divinity, so to say, as if forgetting. But much bigger is the Holocaust of divine Prakriti, which becomes now this inanimate, mechanical nature or partially animate mechanical nature. And again, if you relate it to the biblical tradition, you look at the whole concept of Adam and Eve, you come to this same idea represented in a different symbol. Adam being the soul, conscious Purusha, and Eve made of his rib. The word for rib in the original Hebrew tradition is will. It's the same word, will. His will pours out or moves to form this nature. And nature tempts the soul and binds it in the temptation, or the soul consents to be tempted and to be bound, and there's the play now of the struggle and the loss of the paradisal or the divine awareness in the fall. So it is much more a fall of nature and the soul participating or sucked into the fall and therefore experiencing this duality and the struggle and all the rest that follows. And the awakening is the recognition that you are not a product of Prakriti, you are that. And then discovering also your own nature is itself, in its origin, conscious nature. And so there's a double awakening. The soul awakes to its divinity, and its nature also awakes to its divine character, divine conscious nature, which is the part which in the integral yoga is the transformation of your nature. It begins with your highest parts, with the mind awakening and opening to the higher consciousness of the light, which begins to fill it and divinize it, and then successively top down purifies and transforms the nature until that character, which is of the liberated divine nature, now fills all the way down into your most material consciousness. At which point, the energy which forms even your body will experience and know the divine presence and experience this infinity and the absolute of the divine in everything and share in the freedom of the divine. That union of Ishwara and Shakti, which is above, is now replicated here in your soul and your nature, both being awakened to their divinity. Ishvara Shakti union there is now being formed here in the individual. And so, what you will, your nature forms and expresses freely. Your nature is an expression of yourself. You are your nature at rest or in freedom. And the duality or the conflict between is healed. And that becomes the divine life on earth. And that's the kingdom of God manifested on earth, in the body, in form. So it's a fascinating text, and you can see how it's going to the very most important problem of our existence itself. You know, when people face problems of life, we try to fix the problem. So I have money problem, I will try to fix it by earning more, by working harder, by investing wisely, whatever it is you do, or by stealing even. Or if you have health problem, you get yourself fixed by a doctor, change your lifestyle, do exercise, whatever form it takes. But when you have identity problem, what do you do? How do you fix that? I am unhappy. And I realize I don't have a reason to be unhappy externally, but I'm unhappy innately. What do I do with myself? And that's when one gets stuck. And that's when you're forced to turn to other means than external fix through form. Nature processes you can fix through nature process, at least partially, temporarily. Eventually, some other problem comes up. But consciousness is not fixed by process, is fixed by consciousness. And what do you do there? You have to change yourself. I don't like me. I don't even want to exist. I'm sick of this. I'm tired of this existence. Dissolve me is the first response. I want to get free of me. And so the very next paragraph after this, which we will see later, he says that we have this hope that we can escape, but it doesn't really work and it's not really satisfying. And he'll explain why. And then what do you do when you see you can't escape or the escape is itself not satisfying? I have to change me, but what is it? And the question is, what am I truly? Because what I am, I don't like. There is obviously something more true, more essential, which is truly me. And when you begin to grow close to that, or when that begins to come forward, then the whole thing changes. And the joy of life begins to fill the. And in spite of external problems, I am happy. It can happen in very simple ways. We have somebody in the ashram, he's now almost 90. He said to me, when I was 20, one day I woke up and I said, I don't need to be unhappy. Happiness is a choice. It's my choice to be happy. No one can force me to be unhappy if I don't want to be. And then I decided I'll never again be unhappy ever again. And since then, I've never been unhappy. If you think about it this way, it's actually as simple as that. But he could do it because in his consciousness, maybe from past work, his awareness of I had already disengaged enough from the identification with nature. As long as you're identified, you will keep saying, but this should happen, then I will be happy. Or I'm unhappy because that thing is not happening or that other thing is happening. When you've disengaged yourself, you realize, no, I have a choice to be happy, period. Irrespective of what else. You can give me all the problems of the world. Yes, I don't want those problems to be there. I'm sick of the problems, but I can choose to be happy irrespective of the problems. And this is the first discovery you make when you separate your Purusha status from nature. And this can be done. And so this introspection, when you come to your recognition that I am the problem, after having made an attempt to escape and it doesn't work, well, you start changing yourself. And you can start in a very mental way. And this was really a mental choice, to make a choice not to be unhappy, period. You throw anything at me, I refuse to be unhappy. It's still a surface part of the mind. But it can do this because somewhere deep within there is something which is not unhappy. And you can choose to be unhappy because that is your true nature somewhere deep inside. Unhappiness is a falsehood, is a distortion. And then if you begin to introspect further and turn to the source, which is the joy or the bliss, of which happiness is a reflection or a form, and or if that influence begins to fill more and more of your life, that's when you have the true joy and the true enjoyment. And this begins by becoming conscious that there is within us, somewhere deep inside, maybe veiled, that divine presence which is you. And it is an aspect, an element, a part of the divine bliss. And if you accept that the real you is hidden within and you begin to become conscious of it, or even turning to it in a quiet aspiration, even inviting its influence, or relating to it with love, with a self giving, and invoking it, that influence begins to fill like a very fine perfume, and then it begins to grow, and then it becomes to come forward more and more, and that's it. The whole game has changed. It can be as simple as that. From the perspective of the integral yoga, Sri Aurobindo emphasizes this coming forward of the psychic being as the first foundation. If this much is done, all the rest becomes much easier and much more rapid and joyous. So we'll continue this from the 2nd of November. Om